All right, Houman Majd is an author, a journalist, a fiction writer, and a former entertainment industry executive. Just your standard resume. He was born in Iran, came to the U.S. for college, stayed in the U.S. after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. When Mahmoud Ahmadinejad spoke at the United Nations in 2008, Houman served as his translator, and Houman has written 2 books about Iran and spent most of the last year there, if I'm not mistaken. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
As someone who, I think, as much as anyone, is living between the two worlds of the United States and Iran, I just want to get your initial impressions about how you are watching this national conversation emerging here in the United States about Iran and Iran's possible attempts to acquire a nuclear weapon. I want to hedge as much as possible. And the conversation actually happened in Iran, which of course we never think about or talk about in the United States.
Yeah, well, the conversation in Iran isn't very much about the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue is a popular issue in Iran, still is. The conversation in Iran is a conversation that people have everywhere in the world, ordinary people have everywhere in the world, which is how do I make a living? How do I survive on a day-to-day basis when there's all this pressure, not just from the outside, but also from your own government in Iran. And so people aren't really thinking about the nuclear issue that much. In terms of getting bombed, yes, they are thinking of it, but and the potential to be bombed, particularly with all the current threats against Iran. But day-to-day life goes on. People are not happy economically, which is again the thing that everywhere in the world people want economic security first. But beyond that, they have their ordinary lives. People are there's certain anti-government movements within Iran still, but not to the degree that we saw in 2009, certainly, and there isn't anything like the Arab Spring happening in Iran, or even the beginning of an Arab Spring.
Why is that the case? I mean, we saw obviously the amazing uprising in the streets in 2009, and in some ways was a precursor, I think. Obviously, we should be clear that Iran is not an Arabic country; it's a Persian country. It has a different language and tradition, but it's in the region, and obviously there are some obvious similarities in terms of this outpouring of civil disobedience.
Yeah, in a strange way, though, of course, the Iranian government, the Iranian regime has said that wasn't the precursor. The precursor was our revolution of 1979. But in a way, they're right, because what's happening in the Arab Spring, well, what we've seen in the Arab Spring is that people have come together and demanded the fall of a regime. We want this regime to go, which is exactly what happened in 1979 in Iran. We want the Shah to go. They didn't really think about what comes next, and many people were disappointed in Iran, of course. And Iran,
yes, the Marxists who were part of that.
Yeah, and the Israelis have warned everyone and said, look, you don't know what you're going to get next. And so Iran has been right to some degree that was what happened. And of course, we see what's happening in Egypt to some degree, in Tunisia, obviously in Libya, where the Islamists are gaining power. And this could happen in Syria as well. What happened in Iran in 2009 was not about regime change. It never began as regime change. There were certain elements of society that did want and still do want regime change. But that wasn't the call of the people. People were really upset about this, what they thought was a fraudulent vote. They came out, demanded a recount, demanded a change, were unable to get the government to agree to any kind of compromise.
I want to should bomb.
Right, and it's astonishing that the Republican nominees keep on talking about an Iranian nuclear weapons program as if it exists and they're about to build a bomb.
And it simply has not been definitively established.
Not even close.
Not even close to it.
And we're sending people to Jerusalem to say, we really don't think this. You should do this. Sanctions may work.
And yet,
this is not
at the same time, there seems to be a consensus, although not a bedrock consensus, but some consensus among the political elites of Israel that some kind of military strike is imminent or necessary. And my question to you is, one of the things we've seen, and this is Chris Hedges in his great book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, writes about this very beautifully, about how the way that attacks on a country destroy dissent, right? There's a rally around the flag, and he talks about being in Argentina during the military dictatorship when the British war over the Malvinas. All of a sudden, all the leftists he knew were in the streets supporting the military dictatorship because they had this external foe. And I wonder what you think the consequences in Iran would be of an Israeli military strike.
I mean, look at you don't have to go look at Argentina. Look at U.S. and 9/11. I mean, the day after 9/11, the flags on Park Avenue here were, I'd never seen anything like that. The number of American flags. George Bush's popularity went to what, 99%? Or something like that. The Israeli people or Jews are not unpopular in Iran. Iran is not an anti-Semitic nation in the way some other countries in the region are. There is anti-Semitism, don't get me wrong. There's anti-Semitism everywhere, and including in Iran. And the president of Iran, you could consider anti-Semite. But the people of Iran are not particularly anti-Israeli. They're very anti-Israeli policy, very anti-Israeli government's policy towards the Palestinians. But if Israel were to attack Iran, I can tell you the Iranian people would become very anti-Israeli people.
Working with a former very senior CIA analyst who spent his entire career working on political Islam, and he told me a story that right after 9/11, Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld were really pushing to invade Iraq. And this analyst stood up, and in fact Tenet recounts this in his book. This analyst stood up and said to them, and it was pretty brave to do this at the time because it was right after 9/11, if you're going to invade Iraq, it's not because they have WMD, it's because you want regime change, and you need to be clear about that because there are no WMD. And let's remember, Cheney and Libby went to the CIA 20-something times to say, give us different intelligence. What you get, and Jim Risen and Mark Mazzetti had a big piece in the New York Times yesterday interviewing all of these intelligence analysts on Iran, former intelligence analysts, current intelligence analysts, who are saying that Iran is not nearly as far along in the production of a nuclear weapon as is being implied by the neocons and the very people that delivered us the lie-laden war against Iraq.
In my opinion, we shouldn't be talking about whether Iran is close to having a nuclear weapon or not. It doesn't really matter. Do we still want to go to war?
Right.
Does it matter if they're 2 years away, 5 years away? Do we know
that's
if
a
they
great
intend
point.
to? It's not like, oh my God, they're going to, even if they have a nuclear one, let's talk about that too.
I'm glad you raised that point because I do think, because I think actually it's important to sort of to push out the push outside of the box that we're contained in when we talk about these discussions, which tend to be these cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
Well, if we're going to have well, then we'll bomb. Well, it's only in this area of political life that we think, well, we have this problem and violence can solve it, right?
Yes.
There's no other area of life where we say, well, I don't know, my neighbor's going to do this, and if he does, well, then I'm just going to have to go to his house and smash him, right? Because the fact of the matter is we have rejected that as a means of living together, right? I mean, obviously this is now I'm sounding like a sort of cliche of a utopian lefty, but the fact of the matter is, international law and ways of dealing with these problems nonviolently is ultimately what's going to ensure our survival on the planet.
Yeah, but we're immune from international law in the U.S. We're immune from it because we're the world's most powerful nation. We can do basically what we want.
But the conversation that happens about Iran still seems to be infected with this basic presumption that they're trying to get a nuclear weapon, they're so and so far away from it, and how should we make a decision within that set of sort of stipulated facts about whether they should be bombed or not?
By the way, this narrative plays right into the hands of the Iranian regime. They can say that, the threats we're under, apart from being able to suppress any dissent in Iran, they're going to say, we've always said from 1979 that America's really behind regime change. It's not about anything else. It's really about regime change. So all these threats and all this stuff about we're going to get bombed, these sanctions and all that, nobody in Iran believes that the sanctions are going to work, that they're going to stop the Iranian government from pursuing its nuclear program.
Hang on. Look, in the first place, speaking of international law, Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And it's abiding by it. It's abiding by it.
No, not well. If you think it has a nuclear weapons program, which I do think it has a nuclear weapons program in the sense that it's enriching uranium well beyond.
That's not a weapons program. No, it's enriching uranium at 20% because we refused, the United States refused to sell them the fuel rods for the Tehran nuclear reactor.
The IAEA, which is not us, the IAEA is actually further ahead on this right now than the administration is. The IAEA says we think there's a lot of evidence that they have a nuclear weapons program. Based on the IAEA inspections and based on the
IAEA admits that doubt is based on foreign intelligence.
No, right now it's
not the IAEA's own inspectors. Why not disincentivize Iran from ever taking that step to building a bomb? You can't bomb the knowledge out of them.
How
they have the knowledge.
Wait, hold on one second. But how have they not been? But it seems like disincentivizing Iran to take that step is precisely the policy that's being proposed.
Yeah. But sanctions isn't going to de-incentivize.
Why not?
Well, what would?
Well, you're crippling Iran. You're crippling the Iranian people. You're crippling dissent with sanctions. You're eliminating a middle class.
But if sanctions don't work, I want to hear from you right after this. What will?
Okay.
After the break.
Peter, this is the site of the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Oh, so Saddam Hussein did this?
No.
The Iraqi army?
No.
Some guys from Iraq?
No.
That one lady who visited Iraq that one time?
No, Peter, Iraq had nothing to do with this. It was a bunch of Saudi Arabians, Lebanese, and Egyptians financed by a Saudi Arabian guy living in Afghanistan and sheltered by Pakistanis.
So you're saying we need to invade Iran?
Program. In fact, if you look at where the U.S. intervenes and where it doesn't, it tends to track pretty well with who has a nuclear bomb and who doesn't, in the sense that Libya, let's all remember, gave up famously their nuclear weapons program, and Gaddafi went before the Arab League in this amazing speech and said, oh yeah, I've given up the nuclear weapons, and you guys all think you're friends of the Americans, but they'll be coming for you next, don't you worry. And sure enough, we know what happened to Gaddafi. So it's not irrational they would pursue a nuclear weapon.
It's not irrational, that's true.
So the question is, if we want to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, as someone committed to non-proliferation, I will say that I am in that camp, what can be done if sanctions don't work?
Well, also, I mean, threats, the way that the current atmosphere of threats against Iran, that we're going to bomb you, we're going to bomb you, we're going to bomb you, is much more incentivizing them to build a weapon or put it on a fast track than it is to de-incentivize them. De-incentivizing them is to try to bring them back into the community, the world community, international economic community. What we've done is the opposite. We've had sanctions on Iran for over 30 years. The United States has. And then now
they've intensified.
And we have pressure on other countries to go ahead with other sanctions. Iran is capable of withstanding sanctions. I don't know for how long. The regime is not going to crumble tomorrow because of the sanctions. It's not going to happen in a short time.
Although at the top of the show, at the top of your blog, I should mention, you said that the economic situation there is dire, there's discontent because of it, and I think from the analysis I've read, there is a connection between those two things.
Sure, there's a connection between the sanctions and the economic situation, but right now the Iranian people are not blaming their own government for it at this point. And they may in the future, but right now they're not. They're not saying, oh, you've got to change, you've got to give up our nuclear program in order to ease the sanctions, the effect of the sanctions on it.
Jeremy.
2 points. One, the elephant in the room here is the fact that Israel has a very vibrant nuclear weapons program, 200+ nuclear weapons, and quite likely is behind the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. I mean, the fact is, when we talk about a nuclear-free Middle East, Israel's exempt from that in the same way that the U.S. is exempt from international law when it's convenient to the U.S. agenda.
Right, and we should, the assassination of the nuclear scientists is something we've talked about on the show before. We have, I think, photos. These are 3 of the 5 men we have pictures for who have been...
and I was in Iran when one of them was assassinated back in July. And I was in Iran when military bases started blowing up in Iran as well, which everybody in Iran blamed Mossad back then, way before NBC had a program on it. So it was assumed that the Israelis are doing this.
And the Israelis, I should say, have not exactly issued stern denials of their culpability. You have the head of the Mossad saying, I won't say what we did, but I'm not losing any sleep over it, things like that.
And people in Iran look at, I mean, the people who live in Iran, you have to imagine these are people who have grown up in Iran. They live in Iran. They don't travel all the time. They don't think of someone working on the nuclear program as someone who's working for the regime or working for the Ayatollahs. They don't think of even a bomb as being an Ayatollah's bomb. They think of it as an Iranian bomb. They think of these people as ordinary people who went to university, studied, have jobs, wives, children.
They see them as civilians.
As civilians, yeah. And so when they get blown up, it really affects popular opinion inside Iran. And it's not a good thing. I mean, apart from the moral aspect of it, it's not even good in terms of what the Iranian public opinion is going to be toward U.S. or